You wake before the sun, in a room so cold that your breath hangs in the air above the bed. There is no fire yet, no warm water, no soft light to ease you into the day. If you are a servant, you have perhaps 20 minutes before someone upstairs expects the grates cleaned and the kettle on. If you are a lady of the house, you have longer, but you are not free either, because within the hour someone else's hands will be lacing you into a corset so tight that you will not draw a full breath again until you undress that night. This is not exaggeration. This is simply what it meant to be a woman in Victorian Britain, whichever rung of the ladder you happen to occupy. The corset itself deserves a moment, because it was not a fashion accessory in the way we imagine accessories today. It was engineering, applied daily to the female rib cage, and it shaped far more than silhouette. Doctors of the period wrote with real concern about displaced organs, about women fainting in drawing rooms and on factory floors, about ribs that had, over years of tight lacing, quietly reshaped themselves. And yet women wore them anyway, because a woman without a corset was not considered dressed, was not considered respectable, was not considered marriageable. The garment that restricted her breath was the same garment that allowed her to exist publicly at all. That contradiction sat at the center of almost everything about being a woman in this era. The rules that confined you were also the rules that permitted you entry into society in the first place. Picture two very different mornings happening at the same hour, in the same city, perhaps only a few streets apart. In a townhouse in a fashionable part of London, a lady of means is woken by her maid, dressed in layers that will take the better part of an hour to arrange correctly, and led downstairs to a breakfast she did not cook and will not clear away. Her day will be governed by calling cards, correspondence, needlework, and the careful management of a household staff, all of it performed within a set of rules so rigid that a single misstep, an unchaperoned walk, an unsuitable friendship, a raised voice, could cost her a reputation that took a lifetime to build and an afternoon to destroy. A few streets away, in a cramped set of rooms shared by an entire family, a working woman is already awake, has been for some time, and is preparing to walk to a mill or a laundry or someone else's kitchen for a working day that will often stretch past 12 hours. She will earn perhaps half of what a man doing comparable work receives, a gap that was not hidden or disputed but simply assumed, written into wage books as though it were a law of nature rather than a choice made by employers. When she returns home, her working day is not over. There is still a household to run, children to feed, clothes to mend, water to carry, because domestic labor did not pause simply because paid labor had already exhausted her. What connects these two women, separated by wealth, by education, by every visible marker of status, is something less visible but far more absolute. Neither of them, married, owned very much of anything in the eyes of the law. Under a legal principle that had existed for centuries but remained fully in force for most of the Victorian period, a married woman's property, her wages, even in the earliest decades her very legal identity, belonged to her husband upon marriage. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not, in most circumstances, sue or be sued independently. If she earned money, that money was legally his the moment it was earned. It took a series of Married Women's Property Acts across the 1870s and 1880s to begin dismantling this, and even then, change arrived slowly and unevenly, contested at every stage. This legal invisibility shaped decisions that look, from a modern vantage point, almost incomprehensible, until you understand the framework surrounding them. A woman trapped in a marriage to a violent or reckless husband had almost no recourse, because leaving meant leaving with nothing, often not even her own children, since custody law overwhelmingly favored fathers until reforms very late in the century began to shift that balance. Staying was not naivety. Staying was frequently the only option that did not end in destitution. Once you see the legal architecture clearly, the choices women made stop looking like weakness and start looking like the only rational calculation available inside a system designed without their interests in mind. Childbirth sat at the center of a woman's expected purpose, and it carried a weight of danger that is almost impossible to imagine today. Across the Victorian period, a meaningful proportion of maternal deaths were linked directly to childbirth and its complications. An infection following delivery, often called childbed fever, killed women in numbers that horrified even contemporary observers. The cause, poor hygiene practices among attendants moving between patients without adequate hand washing, was identified and argued over for decades before it was widely accepted and acted upon, which meant that for much of the century, women were dying from a problem that was, in principle, preventable. A woman entering labor was, in a very real sense, taking a risk with her life, repeatedly, because large families were both expected and economically necessary, particularly among the working classes, where children became wage earners themselves from a startlingly young age. And children did work. Factory legislation across the 1830s and 1840s gradually restricted the youngest ages and the longest hours, but before those reforms, and in industries the acts did not fully cover, children as young as 5 or 6 labored in mines, mills, and workshops. For a working mother, this meant something particular and painful. The choice was rarely between her child working and her child attending school in any meaningful sense, because school itself was neither universal nor free until later reforms, but between which form of hardship the family could survive. To judge these choices by modern comfort is to misunderstand entirely the arithmetic of survival that governed them. Medicine of the period treated the female body itself as a source of instability, and this belief shaped how women's genuine physical and emotional suffering was understood and, very often, dismissed. A wide and vague range of symptoms, fatigue, anxiety, irritability, even ordinary exhaustion after childbirth or grief, was frequently gathered under the diagnosis of hysteria, a label rooted in an ancient and thoroughly discredited theory about the womb itself causing disorder throughout the body. Treatments prescribed for this diagnosis ranged from complete bed rest lasting weeks, which for a woman already isolated could deepen her distress rather than ease it, to travel, to changes of air, none of which addressed whatever the woman was actually experiencing. A woman who challenged her doctor's assessment, or who simply expressed anger or frustration in a manner considered unfeminine, risked having that very reaction used as further evidence that something was medically wrong with her, a closed loop that offered very little genuine escape. Widowhood brought its own precise and demanding rules, made famous nationally by the Queen herself, who withdrew from public view and wore black for decades following the death of her husband, setting a tone that filtered down through every level of society with varying degrees of strictness. A widow of means was expected to observe a period of deep mourning lasting up to a year or more, during which she wore unrelieved black, avoided social engagements, and gradually eased into lighter shades of grey and lavender as the mourning period progressed through its recognized stages. For a widow without means, however, mourning was a luxury she frequently could not afford, since the correct clothing itself cost money she did not have, and the social judgment for failing to dress the part could be nearly as damaging as the loss itself, layering financial hardship directly on top of grief. Unmarried women without inherited wealth occupied one of the most precarious positions of the entire era, because Victorian society offered almost no respectable script for a woman who was neither a wife nor formally employed in a role considered suitable for her class. A woman of some education but no fortune often became a governess, living inside a family's household in a strange, suspended status, too educated to belong among the servants, too poor to belong among the family she served, eating alone, socializing with almost no one, and facing a working life with very limited security once her charges grew too old to need her. The term left on the shelf, used casually at the time to describe an unmarried woman past a certain age, captures with uncomfortable precision just how narrowly a woman's worth was measured against the single achievement of securing a husband. Domestic service deserves particular attention, because by the middle of the Victorian period it had become the single largest category of female employment in the country, employing more women than any factory industry. A live-in servant, and the vast majority of female domestic workers lived under their employer's roof, surrendered an enormous portion of her freedom in exchange for food, lodging, and a wage that was often withheld until the end of a contracted term specifically to discourage her from leaving early. Her hours were dictated entirely by the household's needs. Her personal relationships were subject to her employer's approval, since many households forbade followers, meaning suitors, from calling at all. Her bedroom, if she had a private one, was frequently an attic room with no heating, positioned as far from the family's living quarters as the architecture allowed, a physical arrangement that mirrored precisely how the household understood her place within it. Consider the scale of this for a moment, because numbers on a page rarely convey what they mean in a life. By the later decades of the century, well over 1 million women in England and Wales worked in domestic service, a figure larger than the population of several major cities of the period combined. That is not a niche occupation. That is the default working life available to an enormous share of the female population, particularly those without family wealth or formal education, which meant that for the majority of working women, the choice was never between different professions in any meaningful sense, but between service, factory work, or the needle trades, 3 doors that all led, in different ways, to long hours and very little security. The needle trades, dressmaking, millinery, the endless piecework of shirt finishing done by hand in cramped rented rooms, deserve their own mention because they represent one of the era's cruelest contradictions. Women stitched, by hand and later by early sewing machine, the very garments, the fashionable dresses and elaborate bonnets, that expressed and enforced the standards of femininity they themselves could never afford to meet. A seamstress might work by candlelight until her eyesight failed, paid by the piece rather than the hour, racing against deadlines set by wealthy clients who never considered, and rarely knew, the conditions under which their clothing had been produced. The dress that signaled a lady's respectability at a ball had very often passed through hands that would never see the inside of that ballroom. Fashion carried dangers that went well beyond restricted breathing, and this is worth dwelling on because it reveals something true about how appearance and mortality intersected in ways that would seem extraordinary today. Certain popular dyes of the period, prized for their brilliant green color, contained arsenic compounds, and women who wore, or manufactured, garments and even hair ornaments treated with these dyes suffered documented skin irritation and, in cases involving prolonged exposure among workers producing the material, far more serious poisoning. The pursuit of an admired shade of green was, quite literally, pursuit that carried physical risk, and this was known, argued about in the press, and yet the fashion persisted for years because desirability outweighed caution in a marketplace that had little regulation to enforce otherwise. Education, or the deliberate limitation of it, shaped every one of these outcomes long before a woman reached adulthood. For most of the Victorian period, formal schooling for girls, where it existed at all, emphasized accomplishments considered suitable for marriage, needlework, music, a little French, rather than the mathematics, sciences, or classical education offered to boys of comparable class. Universities did not admit women to full membership and degrees for the majority of the century, meaning that even a woman of considerable intellect and family support faced doors that were simply not open to her, not because she lacked capability, but because the institutions had been built, quite deliberately, without her in mind. Reformers pushed against this steadily from the middle of the century onward, and progress, real progress, did occur, but it occurred against sustained resistance from those who genuinely believed that educating women beyond a certain point was unnatural or even medically unwise. What is easy to miss, looking back with the comfort of hindsight, is that almost none of this was experienced by Victorian women as a monolithic, unbroken oppression they simply endured in silence. Women organized, petitioned, wrote, and pushed against these boundaries throughout the period, often at real personal cost. The campaigns that produced the Married Women's Property Acts, the gradual opening of higher education, the early trade union efforts among female factory and textile workers, all of these were driven by women who understood their circumstances with total clarity and worked, often for decades, to change them incrementally, one legal reform, one open door, at a time. The image of the passive Victorian woman, waiting quietly for a more enlightened century to arrive, does not survive close contact with the historical record. So why does any of this still matter to us now, comfortably removed from corsets and coverture and candlelit piecework? Because the legal and social architecture built during this period did not vanish the moment the century ended. Property rights, custody law, equal pay, access to higher education, each of these battles fought by Victorian women established the legal foundations that later reformers built upon, often quite directly, sometimes citing the same arguments almost word for word decades later. The gap in the wage books that seemed simply natural to a Victorian employer has a direct, traceable line to pay gaps still debated in workplaces today, and understanding where that assumption came from is part of understanding why it has been so difficult to fully dismantle. Here is something worth sitting with before you move on to whatever comes next in your day. If a woman living in 1870 could see the life of an ordinary woman today, walking freely into a bank to open an account in her own name, choosing whether and when to marry without economic desperation forcing the decision, what do you think would strike her first as the most astonishing change, and what do you think would surprise her to learn has still not fully changed at all? That question sits at the heart of why this history refuses to feel entirely finished, and it might be worth leaving in the comments below, because the answer says as much about the present as it does about the past. The Victorian woman was not one figure but millions of them, dressed differently, paid differently, treated differently depending on the street she happened to live on, and yet bound together by a set of laws and expectations that none of them had written and few of them had ever been asked to approve. She rose before dawn or she rose in comfort, but either way, she rose into a world built around her usefulness to others rather than her own authority over her life, and the fact that so many of these women pushed against that architecture anyway, quietly or loudly, successfully or not, is perhaps the most brutal and the most remarkable part of the whole story. If this glimpse into a life so different from our own, and yet so directly connected to it, left you thinking differently about the rooms and rules that shaped Victorian Britain, consider staying for the next one, because there is a great deal more hidden in the corners of this century than most people ever get told. And if you know someone who would find this particular corner of history as unsettling and as fascinating as you just have, this is exactly the sort of story worth sending their way.